Wine Enthusiast Magazine, this is the Wine Enthusiast Podcast. I'm Executive Editor Susan Kostrava. Coming up, American spirits. Craft distillers are on the rise in the United States. This week, we'll raise a glass to the Americans behind those small batch stills. Like the whiskey master, whose wizardry is changing the face and taste of American single malts.
There's very few people that are actually trying to be American Scotch, but we're one of those handful that's deliberately trying to be a good Speyside.
Plus, we'll meet the team behind a brand new artisanal vodka with a twist.
Vodka from kombucha? What? It certainly raises some eyebrows, but then the flavor itself, it could stand alone, I think, just on flavor without the stories.
And we'll hear from U.S. Army veterans on a mission to make world-class bourbon.
On a national scale, we're representing the military, and we're going to make a product that they are going to be proud of, and we're going to put our heart and soul into everything we do here.
It's coming up on the Wine Enthusiast Podcast. Blue Apron wine. Yes, wine. If Blue Apron could make home cooking cool again, why not the Wine Club? Blue Apron only seeks out best-of-breed wines, including Uvaggio, a regular enthusiast editor's choice pick. Most other wine clubs just send you cheap reds and whites dressed up with fanciful labels. Only Blue Apron wine has some of the world's best winemakers working with them exclusively. Get $25 off your first shipment of 6 wines at blueapron.com/corkscrew. Mark Twain once said, "Too much of anything is bad, but too much good whiskey is barely enough." Nowadays, it's getting easier and easier to find good whiskey. And we're talking single malt craft whiskey, made right here in the United States. The American Single Malt Whiskey Commission was formed just 2 years ago, and already it includes more than 70 distillers. One of the biggest movers and shakers in the American single malt industry is a master distiller who's been called a whiskey luminary, Mr. Whiskey, and even the Johnny Appleseed of American whiskey. His name is Dave Pickerel, and he's spent years as a renowned consultant for the American craft distilling movement. Thanks to Dave's whiskey wizardry in New York's Hudson Valley, wine enthusiasts named Hill Rock Estate Distillery's American Single Malt the best ever. Spirits editor Kara Newman recently caught up with Dave Pickerel while he was out on the road distillery hopping. As Dave explains, going into the whiskey business wasn't originally his plan.
I was just going to go be a chemical engineer. And while I was getting my master's in chemical engineering, my mentor discovered that I'm an idiot savant at distilling. He decided that the beverage alcohol industry needed me. And so when I got in with my military service and I was just ready to be a chemical engineer, he insisted that I join a small consulting firm in Louisville that he said needed me. And so for about 5 years, I just trundled around the world building distilleries and parts of distilleries. And got to work in China, Mexico, Canada, Scotland, the Dominican Republic, all over the U.S. And one of my clients was Maker's Mark. One day, Bill Samuels walked out of his office and asked me if I wanted to be his master distiller. Literally, I didn't even apply. He just offered it to me. And of course, I said yes. And I think the only time in my life I've ever stuttered. It took me like 60 seconds to get yes out. Then I got to sit at the feet of Bill Samuels for 14 years, learning about growing brands. But then the bug for craft spirits got me, and about 10 years ago, I left Maker's Mark to start my own company called Oakview Spirits with the goal of helping other people get started in the craft spirit movement.
And tell us how you came to Hill Rock and how you started your journey making American single malt.
One of the things that I did early on was I wanted to do a little writing. And actually wrote a piece for what was then called Malt Advocate magazine, now Whiskey Advocate. And it was kind of a look forward at what I thought was going to happen in the craft spirit world. And one of the things that I talked about rather extensively was the possibility of terroir in whiskey, in American whiskey. And up to that time, pretty much all the American whiskey was made in the same geographical area, so there was no real discussion about terroir. But with the advent of distilleries in New York and Florida and Seattle, Washington, of all places, there would begin to be a discussion about terroir. And so a guy named Jeff Baker, the owner of Hill Rock, saw that article and said, that's what I want to do. He basically said, I want to partner up with you, and we want to express terroir in whiskey, and I want two things. I want internationally award-winning whiskeys, and eventually I want a big smoke bomb Scotch-style whiskey. And other than that, you're going to have binoculars to see from one goal line to the other. Have fun. And with something like that, I couldn't help but to join on. And so we started with the Solera aged bourbon, then we did a double cask rye, and finally we tackled the daddy of them all, the single malt. Our goal was to essentially be the American Speyside Scotch. Kind of my view on the world is of single malts is when craft beer started, the big guys were making water and light water, and there was a hole as big as All Outdoors for the craft beer guys to jump in and make APAs and IPAs and wit beers and on and on and on. In the craft spirit space, that wasn't true, because the big guys were already playing in every market and making really good products in every market, except American single malt. And there were no big guys in that arena. And so the craft guys started flocking into that space. There's very few people that are actually trying to be American Scotch, if you'll pardon the expression. They're just trying to be different. But we're one of those handful that's deliberately trying to be a good Speyside. And literally, we do everything the way they do in Scotland except three things. We're not in Scotland, and we can't fix that. By American law, the whiskey has to go into a new barrel first, so it does. But in our case, as soon as it's practical, we get it out of the new barrel and put it in a used barrel because that's where it belongs. And the third is we don't add any caramel coloring to our whiskey because we're kind of happy with the color already. But other than that, we literally do everything the way they do in Scotland, including malting our own grain and using peat from Speyside that we got imported. And then to top it all off, once we're done with everything, it first goes into a Pedro Jimenez barrel and then an Oloroso barrel, just to give it a little sherry influence, so that we can just be right in there slugging away with the rest of the guys from Scotland.
So you said something I'd like to back up to. You were talking about the concept of terroir in whiskey, and I love that. I mean, you know, we're a wine publication, and we talk all the time about how certain regions have their own terroir. I mean, you can talk about Sauvignon Blanc and how it's made in France versus New Zealand versus Washington State, and it tastes a little different no matter where you are. And I love that you're trying to do that with whiskey too. I mean, do you really think that whiskey can actually have terroir?
Oh, heavens, yes. And especially single malt. It was a concept more than anything until we started distilling. And literally, when we turned on the still, the first batch, in the distillate, you could taste cinnamon and clove. And that's what our fields give us. And that's how our fields speak their terroirs, in cinnamon and clove. It's in everything we do. And it's not a matter of fighting it. It's a matter of hugging it, because that's one of the main terroir elements for our products. We're actually, I'll spill the beans to you. I haven't told anybody this yet. But for years, we've been harvesting our barley field by field and making whiskey on a field-by-field basis. And some of that will start coming of age within the next year or so. My hope is that we can actually identify terroir down to the field level.
Now, that's exciting. I mean, that's not just single estate. I mean, that's single field. I haven't really heard of that before.
You know, it's one of those things, somebody's got to do it. We'll see very shortly whether it's worth our while or not. I really hope that there is a distinguishable terroir, because that could be a game changer.
What do you say to people who contend that you just couldn't possibly make an American single malt that could ever compare to Scotch?
Basically, I would challenge people, taste it. Taste the Hill Rock single malt, taste the Westland single malt, taste the Balcones. There are some great American single malts out there right now.
So what do you think is next for the world of American single malt?
Well, I think a number of things. The first thing to know is there's a lot of learning going on, and the products continue to get better and better and better. And I think as time goes along, we'll see that certainly happen with a proliferation of really good tasting malt whiskeys made in the United States. It's a great time to be in the craft spirit world. The fun thing is, if you're a big guy, your barrier to innovation is maybe 50,000 cases in year one. If you're a craft guy, the barrier to innovation is like 3 cases. I actually know of a distiller who in order to try something and to get it in the hands of judges, would make 3 cases worth of a product just to see, is this good enough to stand up? And that means that we can play a lot more and we can find a lot more cool stuff.
Is there an American single malt that you'd single out as exceptional? If so, we want to hear about it. Send an email to podcast@winemag.com and tell us where you found it and why it's not to be missed. Again, our address is podcast@winemag.com. And you can read about other trailblazers of the American single malt movement in the March edition of Wine Enthusiast magazine. Kara Newman spoke with producers from Seattle to Brooklyn. You can learn what makes them tick at winemag.com. When Dave Pickerel isn't on the road consulting, he's the master distiller at Whistlepig, the legendary rye whiskey distillery in Vermont. Whistlepig's tasting room is one of the stops on the Middlebury Tasting Trail. Within a 10-mile radius, in the heart of the Champlain Valley, you'll find more than 6 independent producers of craft beer, wine, cider, and spirits. And if you follow the trail about a mile north from Whistlepig's tasting room, you'll reach Appalachian Gap Distillery. In an unassuming industrial park outside downtown Middlebury, Appalachian Gap crafts a number of spirits, including whiskey, gin, coffee liqueur, and, most recently, vodka. But not just any vodka. 300 yards from the distillery's front door is Aqua Vitae Kombucha, a popular purveyor of the naturally fermented tea drink. The neighboring businesses recently joined forces to make Aqua Vodka, an artisanal vodka that uses the excess alcohol produced when you ferment kombucha. Podcast producer Rebecca Shear recently sat down with Appalachian Gap Distillery's Lars Hubbard and Aqua Vitae Kombucha's Jeff Weber. Jeff began by explaining how he got into the kombucha business.
My wife relocated us out to Portland, Oregon to study naturopathic medicine. And while we were out there, I took a job brewing beer. I was drinking beer at 6 in the morning. Sometimes I was still drinking beer at 2 in the morning. And she was studying for tests all the time, and we started to kind of split apart a little bit. And I realized that we needed to find a way to synchronize our lifestyles. And she started educating me about the important role of nutrition. And we started this journey together and found a beverage that fit both categories. And so we started brewing kombucha using some of the brewing equipment that was available to us in the brewery. So our plan was to move back to Vermont, where we had started our journey together, and use kombucha sort of as a platform to help build her practice. And now her practice is helping to support our business. So,
when did you realize there might be a problem or issue in terms of the alcohol content in the kombucha that you were brewing?
I got a knock on the door from the Department of Liquor Control and the Tax and Trade Bureau and the TTB, which is also more commonly known as the ATF. And they spent the next 4 or 5 hours with me digging through our process, taking samples. And they were kind of cryptic, but I pulled out of them that they had been studying product on the market, had been testing it, had found elevated alcohol levels, and we're now going to see if those levels were happening right from the brewery or if they were happening in the field, kind of secondary fermentation happening in the bottles. And so it was a very nerve-wracking afternoon. So after they left, I took all the duplicate samples that they had just taken from our brewery and sent them to a state lab. We got results back in maybe 3 weeks and saw that, yes, indeed, there was elevated levels. A non-alcoholic product needs to be under 0.5%, and we saw things as high as 2.5%.
So what did you do?
We immediately reached out to Cornell Food Science and got connected to a laboratory over there. We started doing a lot of biological work, understanding how to manipulate, I guess you'd say, the fermentation to keep the alcohol down. Kombucha is a complex fermentation. It's really made from simple ingredients, but the fermentation is difficult because there's so many different microorganisms. Whereas a beer, a wine, a lot of these things are controlled with a single organism. And, for thousands of years, people have learned how to control a single yeast to make beer with. And here's kombucha, and it's got 2 yeasts, and it's got multiple strands of bacteria, and all these other things that when you DNA test them have never been identified before. And we thought, let's just break this down, and we'll pull it apart, we'll fix the organisms, and we'll put it back together and make kombucha, and it'll be perfect. That was very difficult for us. We found a machine that was being used by Free. We discovered Free Wine. They had purchased a machine that could remove alcohol from wine. And so we started looking at that and investigating it. And it was perfect except for the price tag. It was a $2 million machine, and so it was completely unattainable for us. So we had to figure out a way to make our product biologically. And when we got to the point where we couldn't scale with that anymore, that machine really became our only option. So we dedicated everything we could to finding a way to purchase one of those machines.
So you have this machine that sort of uses pressure to separate the alcohol from the base liquid. And when you began using this machine, did you ever think you'd be on your way to entering the spirits business?
Well, I realized early on that when we dedicated ourselves to this solution, that we were going to have a byproduct of alcohol. And that was going to become a next challenge of what do we do with all this excess alcohol that we have.
Tell us then how your two companies came together. Can you give us a play-by-play of how this partnership came to be?
Play-by-play? I don't think we have one of those. We actually, we were doing a tasting in town here in Middlebury of our spirits, and Jordan Benjamin, who is the CFO officially of Aqua Vodka, started talking to my business partner about what we could do and the problem that they were having. And so then Jeff came over and we sat down and talked about what we could do. They tasted the spirits that we've made. We talked a little bit about the process, and we decided to do a test batch and see how it worked out.
Can you explain how the extracted alcohol from the kombucha actually makes its way into the vodka?
Well, we basically redistill that extracted alcohol. They ship it over to us at about 60% alcohol, and we redistill it. And then we get about 40% of the total alcohol they send to us is good, clean ethanol, and so that's what becomes Aqua Vodka. One of the things to understand about a small distillery like ours is we're able to tease out a lot of flavors. In the distilling business, they're called congeners. They're things that modify the flavor of the alcohol. And because we're a small distillery, we're sort of hands-on, we can tease out the really sort of sweet flavors that we want to get and everything. Kombucha, by virtue of the fact that it has all those microorganisms making alcohol, has a lot of what are called higher alcohols, methanols, wood alcohol, all sorts of stuff that is pretty vicious in flavor and dangerous. So we had to work out a process to basically strip all that out and get to the really sweet, gorgeous spirit that we've managed to make. So that was actually the hardest part, was figuring out how to distill it so that it would give us the flavor that we wanted.
Can you describe how Aqua Vodka tastes, what notes we sense in there?
Well, have you ever tasted kombucha?
Yes.
Okay, so there's a sort of a fruitiness, but also an earthiness. There's a slight bitterness to it, and it's just got incredibly complex flavors. And what we found when we made the vodka is we're actually able to pull almost all of those flavors through. These are the congeners that we're able to pull through. So it tastes like super purified kombucha to me. It's got a sort of a stronger fruity note to it.
Do you feel like this is at all going to be a hard sell, kombucha, vodka?
I think, the vodka category is very crowded, and a lot of people question me, why did we start with vodka? It's kind of because it is a crowded category. I think that this product is so unique that it will rise above, and that's the feedback we've gotten as we've sold it into restaurants. A lot of restaurants whiskey's really hot right now, and they're really kind of scaling back on their vodka selections and being very thoughtful about what they'll put in for vodka. And this one rises above a lot that's on the market right now. It's an easy story for the servers to tell, it's like, vodka from kombucha, what? And it certainly raises some eyebrows. But then the flavor itself, it could stand alone, I think, just on flavor without the story. So it's to me, it's an easy sell, especially if people already understand what kombucha is. The vodka is a great example of how, you can take a difficult solution and find opportunity in it.
As of now, you can find Aqua Vodka in Vermont, Massachusetts, New York, and California, where you can taste it in a signature cocktail at Levi's Stadium. You can find a recipe for the Aqua Scooter on our website, winemag.com/podcast. Time for a break, but when we get back, U.S. Army veterans joined forces to create a brand new distillery.
In between troop leading procedures and patrolling and defending the patrol base, we started saying, all right, what are we going to do when we get out of the Army?
It's coming up on the Wine Enthusiast Podcast. Blue Apron Wine. Yes, wine. Awesome wine, in fact. In a head-to-head taste test of several wine clubs, Bloomberg recently wrote, Blue Apron is the clear winner, way more sophisticated in taste. Just as Blue Apron doesn't compromise on the quality of ingredients in their meal boxes, Blue Apron wine only works with incredible vineyards and winemakers, such as Vengi in Napa, Mount Beautiful in New Zealand, and regular enthusiast high scorer Uvaggio. Every amazing wine is just $10 per bottle. Get $25 off your first shipment at blueapron.com/corkscrew. Terms and conditions apply. All orders are handled by Blue Apron Wine, Napa, California. Welcome back to the Wine Enthusiast Podcast. I'm Susan Kostrava. This week, we're highlighting pioneers of the American craft distilling movement with a show we're calling American Spirits. But the next people we'll meet are American heroes.
All right, so we're opening the valve from the spirit tank to the pump, positioning the nozzle over the barrel, and now we fill for 33 gallons.
We're in an industrial garage in St. Albans, Vermont, where Steve Gagnier is filling one of the very first barrels of bourbon from Danger Close Craft Distilling.
Danger close in the military, when you're calling for artillery, if it's close enough to your position, you tell the folks firing the artillery that these rounds are danger close, meaning those are going to impact very close to our position because the enemy's gotten in so close, etc.
As a veteran of the U.S. Army, Steve knows the meaning of danger close firsthand, as does his business partner and fellow veteran, Zach Fike.
You know, if you ever find yourself in that position, which some of us have, that potentially is that last second of your life, and you're relying on someone that you can't see from a far distance to take their time to really understand the fire mission and put those rounds down range to save your life. And we put the same level of detail in our products.
The products Zach's referring to don't just include bourbon. Danger Close is an offshoot of another venture these guys have in the 14th state, 14th Star Brewing Company. Steve says he and his longtime buddy, fellow veteran Matt Kahaya, got hooked on home brewing after returning from the Iraq War. A few years later, the two Army officers were deployed to Afghanistan.
Matt and I, and then very occasionally Zach, we were stationed at a small patrol base in the mountains in eastern Afghanistan. No power, no running water, no internet. And in between troop leading procedures and patrolling and defending the patrol base, meeting with local elders, we had some downtime. And to fill a lot of that downtime and to keep ourselves kind of mentally sharp, we started saying, all right, what are we going to do when we get out of the Army? We each have, about a half dozen years left when we get home, but let's start thinking about it now. And so in the back of one of my notebooks, with no access to information, we just started sketching out the business plan for a small craft brewery.
Fast forward to today, and in a 20,000 square foot space that once housed a bowling alley, 14th Star Brewing Company brews 6,000 gallons of beer a week. Their signature brews include Follow Me American IPA, Tribute Double IPA, and Valor Ale. Proceeds from each batch go to various nonprofits, including the Josh Pallotta Fund.
Josh deployed with us to Afghanistan in our brigade, and when we came home, he succumbed to TBI and PTSD and took his own life. So his mother now runs the Josh Pallotta Fund, and the goal of the Josh Pallotta Fund is to raise awareness of PTSD and reduce veteran suicide, in addition to creating Josh's House, which is a place for veterans to disconnect from the stress of their life, to seek the help that they need, connect with other veterans, and get better in that way.
Steve Gagne says after running 14th Star for a few years, founding a distillery was a logical next move.
The first step in making bourbon or whiskey is to brew beer. I mean, it's a different style of beer than you would normally drink, but it's beer. And we already have a facility where we can brew world-class beer, and so we didn't have to replicate that to create this place. So we brew the beer, technically the wort, which is unfermented beer, at the brewery. We truck it down here and it goes into our fermenters, ferment the wort, which turns into alcohol, and then we can distill the alcohol off from that.
The day we visit Danger Close, the guys are filling their 5th barrel of what will eventually become bourbon. And as Zach Fike points out, those Vermont white oak barrels are handcrafted by veterans who own a cooperage a few towns over.
We served in Afghanistan together, and so we're confident that the same love that we put into our product is the same love they put into their barrels. So it's great having them local, and we can collaborate.
Zach says Danger Close plans to collaborate with many more veterans as time goes on by training them to become entrepreneurs.
We've all deployed, we've all seen war, and when soldiers go off to war, they come back, a different person. I was unfortunately wounded in 2010, and, I'm kind of the rookie to the group, and I've had some amazing leaders and friendship in Steve and Matt, and they've really taught me what the industry is about and the process behind it. And that's actually been kind of my therapy lately, to be able to come here for 12 hours and distill some bourbon, in peace and quiet, has allowed me to reflect on some of the time spent in war, and it's really brought me some peace and clarity. And I think part of our business model going into the future is to be able to share that with other veterans, having them come to our facility, whether it's at the brewery or here at the distillery, learn a trade, give them the confidence to be brave enough to actually take that leap when it comes to business and starting their own business.
And adds Steve Gagne, that business could be anything. The way he sees it, veterans have an advantage when it comes to entrepreneurship.
I think there's 3 things. First, we're used to building and working as a team. And I think our sense of risk is skewed. If the distillery or the brewery goes out of business tomorrow, no one's going to die. And the Army taught us how to plan an operation, from the decisive phase of the operation to the supporting tasks, the sustainment, and it literally translates beautifully into business planning. Right now, we're conducting the shaping operation of putting whiskey into barrels or bourbon into barrels. Our decisive operation is going to be that initial launch. The Army literally trained us to do this. Maybe not the bourbon part, maybe a little bit.
As for when that initial launch is going to be, Steve says they'll likely release their bourbon at the 1 or 2 year mark. They also plan on distilling other spirits, including a rum-type liquor made with vanilla beans and Vermont maple syrup. Though, as Steve and Matt Kahaya point out, given that retirement from the military is still a few years away, all those plans are subject to change.
We're also all deployable, so that kind of plays a factor into
we
things.
Might need to take a year break to do some other stuff.
In the meantime, though, these veterans and friends plan on living out the motto they created for Danger Close Craft Distilling. Keep your friends close and your whiskey danger close. You can see photos of Danger Close Craft Distilling on our website, winemag.com/podcast. While you're there, you can learn more about the Josh Pallotta Fund and other nonprofits supported by 14th Star Brewing Company. Again, it's all at winemag.com/podcast. That's it for today's Wine Enthusiast Podcast. We heard from Kara Newman, Rebecca Shear, and me, Susan Kostrava. Don't want to miss the latest about wine, food, beer, and spirits? Subscribe to the Wine Enthusiast Podcast on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcasts. And please, write us a review. We'd love to hear what you think. We'd also love to stay in touch. Follow Wine Enthusiast Magazine on Facebook and Twitter and use the hashtag WEPodcast. Or visit our website, winemag.com/podcast. The Wine Enthusiast Podcast is produced by Sheeran Shim LLC. Our executive producer is Marina Vatage. I'm Susan Kostrava. See you next time.